Hey YouTube, thanks for watching. Today we're going behind the scenes at my photography studio to check out how I lit this image. Now the lighting in this image is probably not the main element. You can tell that there's a lot of work happened here, I think. So this is going to be a relatively long video. It's about 5 minutes behind the scenes. We'll look at each of the individual lights. I'll show you the exposure from each individual light so you can see what they all do, how they all come together to light the final image. But then most of the work here is done in Photoshop. There is a huge amount of cleanup to be done on this bottle, followed by building out the set. So the whole of the set, the blue shelving at the bottom, that's all just done in Photoshop. Some lighting techniques to make it look realistic, that kind of thing. There'll be a speed edit. Now this was a 2.5 hour edit, I think, all in. It was an absolute nightmare. So I'm going to play it back to you at about 3,500% of the original speed. It'll take about 4 or 5 minutes. If you're interested to see how this edit came together, you can watch that. I will put timestamps in the comments. So if you don't want to watch me editing this blue bottle, you can just jump to the end, look at the layer stack, and I'll talk you through the layers in Photoshop so you can see exactly how this image is made, what we've masked in, what we've masked out, how we've done the frequency separation, and so on. So guys, it's going to be a pretty long video. Grab yourself a coffee. I've wasted enough of your time. Let's get straight over to the studio and see how this was done. Hey guys, I'm back in the studio shooting bottles, and this time it's a blue bottle of Haig Club Whiskey. Now this bottle's caused us a couple of problems, so I'm going to quickly run through the lighting setup, talk about what those problems were and how we're going to fix them in post, and then obviously we'll jump into Photoshop and see if we can come up with a decent final image. So this is a very similar setup to the previous video that I published where we shot a bottle of Dalmore and we had this gradated lighting setup. Now I decided to keep the same lighting setup, so this has been up in the studio overnight. And it's a strip of tracing paper, in fact 2 strips of tracing paper because I needed it to be huge, with a Godox SK300, just a regular strobe light with a strip light. You could do this with a speed light if you had the power. You could do it with hot lights if you wanted to use a longer exposure. So it doesn't have to be any particular brand or make of strobe, it just has to be a strip box firing into the paper. Now I've got a meter width, a 2nd meter width, and the drop is 2 meters. So this is a 2 meter square of paper, and I flagged it off at the back just to stop any light from hitting the background, because I definitely want that to be blue. Now the reason I've done this is because the light will gradiate across the paper and fade out into black by the time it reaches the end. So I'm never going to see a reflection of my light source in the subject. So to start with, let's just have a look at what this looks like when we fire just a single light. Okay, so I like this a lot. It's a good starting point, but I had expected to see more light coming through the bottle. So this was problem number 1. And it wasn't a big deal because we were always going to light the background with a blue gel. So I'm just going to bring that in straight away. It's another SK300. It's the same setup for the gradated light that I used in the Dalmore shoot. And is it Dalmore or Dalmore? Whatever. The only difference being it's got a blue gel over the front. So it's a SK300, Godox SK300 with a reflector, with I think a 10-degree grid, a diffuser to soften the transition, and then a blue gel just sellotaped onto the front of it. So nothing clever, but the effect I think is quite nice. So here we are looking through the bottle essentially. So we've got light coming from the rear with the blue gel, passing through the bottle and really making the bottle glow. So it's a great image, but you'll see there's a mess along the bottom of this bottle, and that was really upsetting when it happened. Now, the bottle has a sticker on it with a load of text. So we pulled that off because we could see it through the bottle, and normally we'd have either rubbing alcohol or nail polish remover to get off any of the sticky glue that's left. Couldn't find it, can't find it anywhere. So after wasting X amount of time, just decided we'll do it in post. So for the rest of this video, we'll have to try and ignore that. But it would be good because I'll show you how to get rid of it in post later on. It's not going to be a problem. It'll take us 2 minutes. It'll be super easy. So if I combine these 2 lights for you now, we'll have a look at the actual image that we're getting as our sort of main image. And you'll see the problem here. The bottle is lit nicely, but we can't see any of the detail in the letters because we've got these soft light sources and we need something specular and hard to really pick out the detail in the letters. So we've got another SK300 positioned above with a gridded beauty dish. So it's gridded for two reasons, and number one is that it will keep the light off of my background and off of my gridated side lights, but also it will give us more contrast. If you experiment with gridding your lights, you'll find that putting a grid on will give you more contrast. So we'll get a better contrast between the highlight that we pick out on the top of the letters and the shadow that's underneath the letters. So I'm going to bring that in and we'll have a look at what would be our final image. Okay, so now we're almost there. If we look at the image, you'll see that we've got nice detail on the lettering. We can kind of read everything that's there. We've got a nice highlight across the shoulder of the bottle and a nice highlight down the front of the cap. But what we're missing is separation from the background. And that's why if you look in the image, you can see we've got a little reflector just poking in. Can't do anything about that at the moment. So what I've got is a final light, so it's a 4-light setup all in all, and it's another Godox light. It's an SK400 this time. I ran out of 300s, what can you do? And I've got a reflector, a nice tight grid, and it's just delivering a glancing blow to this bottle. Now this light causes all sorts of problems, but it gives me some pixels that I definitely want to keep in post. So I'll show you what it does, and we can see what the problems are. Now, I like the light that we've got down the side of the bottle. That's going to give us a really nice separation, and down the right-hand side of the cap. Really, really nice. But the light's shining through the bottle, and the shoulder of the bottle, the top of the bottle, is casting a shadow down the left-hand side, but the light is managing to peek through and remove our gradation. So we don't want any of that in the final image. It's also a little bit messy here and there along the very edge of the bottle, so just the way that it's refracting through the water. So we're going to clean that up in post. So what I'm going to do now is take a final exposure with all the lights firing. I'm going to take that background light out and get what would essentially be a back plate, and then we'll jump into Photoshop and put this stuff together, make a final image. It should be fine. This will be a really quick retouch, by the way, so probably 5 minutes in Photoshop and we'll be good to go.
Guys, I couldn't have been more wrong about this edit. It took forever. Now, to start with, it was all pretty, plain sailing. I'm just masking in the highlights that I want from the light on the right-hand side of the bottle. I used a difference layer there. I don't know if you ever use a difference blend mode, but there was a slight alignment issue. And by using difference blend mode, it's really, really easy to see if things are properly aligned. And so I fixed that problem, mask in the highlights that I want from the right hand side of the image, and crack on with my frequency separation. Now, if you don't know what is going on with the frequency separated workflow, I've basically separated out the detail in the image from the tone and color in the image, so I'm able to work on them separately. And at this point, I'm just knocking over the image with my clone stamp, and I've sped this up to 1,500%. So I'm going pretty quick. All in all, this was about a 2-hour edit, and that was much more than I had expected. I said 2 minutes, didn't I, in the behind the scenes video? So things went pretty badly wrong once we started trying to work on the label in the background. Now, it's nothing that was particularly difficult to deal with, but it was just a long process of balancing out the color. So I'm going to speed this up even more than I normally would, and we'll just have a look at what happens when we start working on the layer at the back of the image. Okay, so I'm finishing off the frequency separation work just on the dust and speckles, inconsistencies in the glass bottle. That's the seam on the plastic label that's stuck on the front. And then we're going to start really working on the texture in the label on the back of the bottle. And what I want to point out is that if you look at the texture on the front of the bottle, you'll see that there is still a lot of quite obvious organic changes in texture. So you can't just sample in any old texture from anywhere. We started off by using texture from the surrounding area, but then there are obviously some pretty hard transitions to be made. So once that's done, I then had to go through and blend the textures so that they transition along the same kind of lines as the highlights and shadows. So there was a lot of work to be done in matching the gradation of the tonal quality and the detail in the texture layer. So at this point, going through and working on the tone, and actually decided to mask in the original lettering so that I could just smooth all of the tone in one fell swoop. So you can see here that I am just finessing the edit around the lettering and then removing the reflection of the beauty dish on the top of the bottle now that that's done. Now, all in all, incidentally, that took me about 2 hours to do the label on the back of the bottle. It wasn't particularly hard work, it wasn't particularly challenging, but it was long and it was upsetting and I was emotional the whole time. So now I'm doing the beauty dish, super easy. I'm sampling colours from the surrounding area and actually painting them in by hand. And it's something that people tend to hesitate to do, but if you have a look, it's a totally acceptable workflow if you're working in frequency separation. I'm taking the texture from the surrounding area using the clone stamp, but all of the colour work was done freehand and just painted in. So now I've got the crop and the edit how I want it. I'm going to start building out a set just using vector shapes. Now the shapes are dropped in and set to be a suitable color, and then I'm dropping in gradients, and you'll notice I put more than one gradient on each layer. I'm setting the gradients how I want them and then clipping them onto the layer after the fact. Always more than one gradient. Same with shadow work. If you're going to put a fake shadow underneath something, at least 2 or 3 shadows with different qualities. Light is more complicated than just a single gradient, so I believe I've got 2 gradients on each of these shapes, and then you can see I've hand painted an additional highlight that's set to soft light just to really give the edge a nice specular highlight to it. Now, once I've done that, I believe I'm going through and adding an additional bevel just using layers, and layer style, sorry. And once I've done that, composite the whole thing together into a single layer in case I wanted to make any other changes. In this case, I didn't. Thank goodness. Probably had enough at this point. Now I'm just going back now I've finished and going over any tiny speckles of dust that I might find. It's always a good idea to do this type of work in passes. I started off with all the big details, then medium details, and now I'm looking for tiny specks of dust here and there. I wouldn't want to do it all in one go. I'd miss stuff. So it's a good idea to kind of work your way from the outside, from the broad brush strokes, and then into the smaller details when you're doing frequency separation for cleanup work. So now I'm just adding a few extra highlights onto the gold letters just to make them pop a little bit more. I felt like they'd got lost. I hadn't really paid enough attention to them in the studio really, so I'm just bringing them out just so they're a little bit lighter in the image, and I believe that's the final thing that we've done. So after we do our sharpening, our contrast curves and that kind of stuff, we'll jump into Photoshop and have a look at the layer stack. Okay guys, just to finish off, I'll give you a quick tour of the layers. You'll notice straight away that I didn't actually use my backplate. I didn't remove the light that was here because I decided to go for a square crop. So here's my final square crop, and here it is with the highlights masked in. You can see from my mask that, if I actually show you the mask instead of deleting it, not a lot going on there really. I'm just getting rid of any pixels that are obnoxious and letting just the highlight show through, and this is obviously set to lighten, so predominantly the pixels are going to match exactly. In fact, if I do this, you can see I've just let the highlight come through on this side. I've let some gradation come in on the bottle, and I haven't bothered to mask out any of the rest of this stuff here because there's no need. The pixels will match exactly. This is set to lighten, so only lighter pixels will show through. So it's the difference between this and this, just that background separation and a bit of a glow. Now here's my frequency separation. So again, guys, God, when I was saying in that video, oh, it'll only take 2 minutes, that's it, isn't it? Once you get really confident in Photoshop, you feel like everything's achievable, but you could tell from that video that it took me forever. But the difference is remarkable, isn't it? I mean, so in terms of like the time it took me to get rid of this label, it was a lot longer than I expected it to be, but fully achievable. I was right in that I could just get rid of it in frequency separation. Okay, so now we've got a box that is literally just made out of a couple of shapes. So I've got my original shapes just here. Let's go through them a bit at a time actually. Let's turn all this other stuff off. So we've got layers of complexity. So we start off with a single shape, and it looks like a single flat shape. It's got a bevel applied to it. Now you can't see that because it's a smart object, and it doesn't want to open up for some reason, whatever. Okay, but this has been applied as a bevel, just using layer styles. Okay, then on top of that, we've got a gradient layer, which is applied as an overlay. And then we've got another gradient layer, which is applied as color dodge. And these are just to add some realism, some depth to the color, a gradient that is believable. And then finally, I've got this edge highlight, which actually, if I just command click, you can see this is just selecting the pixels. There's not really much else I can do to show you this because it's so subtle. But this is just a splodge of paint. It's just white paint. I've set it to soft light so that where I've painted white paint over this image, it is just lightening the edge to give it an additional highlight. And you'll notice these are all clipped onto this box. So although there are pixels all over the place here, because I've just gone over it roughly with my brush, the only pixels that show through are the ones that are directly affecting this blue box, because it's a clipping mask to the layer beneath it. So if I turn that on and off, you can see it really does make quite a big difference, but it's just drawn freehand. Now, then we've got another box. Very, very flat, very unbelievable. Same thing, it's got a bevel applied across the top using layer styles. It's a smart object, so you can't see that, but trust me, I wouldn't lie to you. It's just layer styles. So we've got another gradient. It's a more subtle gradient moving across this way, and it's just black to white. And it's set to multiply just to bring in the contrast. And the same thing again here, it's soft light, black to white, moving away from this area. And then finally the same edge highlight technique, just to give you that sharper edge, a more believable edge down this side. So that's our box. Then because it's let me just zoom right in, because it's made out of shapes and gradients in Photoshop, it's just too perfect. It's CG. So we've added some noise. This is just a mid-gray layer with some noise applied, just to add some grain to that and give it a little bit more realism, and also to break up the banding in the gradient. Now you can see when I zoom out, it looks a bit bandy, but it is a 16-bit image, and it's just because we are looking at it, from a distance. When this is exported, there'll be no banding there, and the grain that we've put on will really help to tie that all together. And again, this is clipped to this box, so it only affects the contents of this file. So that is our box components, and then I've made a composite out of that. I've merged those layers together just in case I wanted to do anything else to them. In this case, I didn't. So here we've got gold lettering, and let me just open that up for you. We've got a few things going on here. So our original gold lettering was pretty dark. It is quite dark on the bottle. It's not really bright, reflective gold lettering, so it kind of snuck past me a little bit in the studio. But what we've got here is... Oh, that's the wrong button. Sorry, guys. We've got this mask. Again, I love masking. I'm sure you're getting that by now. This was a super easy mask. It looks like it would be really hard to put that mask together. When I started out in Photoshop, I couldn't have even comprehended how to get a mask that looked like that from this image, but it was super easy. So I've then just got this color layer, and I've set it to screen, so it's actually lightening the background a little bit. Now I'm not changing any of the highlights or the shadows and things that are there. I'm just adding a bit of the same color. So I've sampled this color from the gold, and I'm putting it on screen mode, so it's adding a lighter version. Then I've got a curves layer, and again, masked in exactly the same way. And my curves layer is just raising the exposure a little bit, so it pops a little bit more, very subtle. And then I've got this gradient fill, which again, is pretty subtle. You'd have to blink to miss it. But what this is doing is, you can kind of see, it's got two dark lines and a highlight in the middle. Let me bring it up so it's really crazy and poppy. There you go. So it's got highlight, shadow, highlight, shadow, highlight, and it's just very subtly playing with the color. So it's not a flat, even color, because that's not what gold lettering looks like. And that is the whole layer stack. So didn't really do very much of this at all, apart from the 2.5 hours that I spent doing frequency separation on the background. So now we've got the classic curves, output curves, the classic output levels, just adding the correct amount of contrast and checking that we're using the full dynamic range of the image, followed by the classic high pass sharpening. Nothing to see here really. Set to soft light, but if we pop it onto normal mode, it's just got all of the detail, the edge highlights and so on, and then it's set to either soft light or overlay depending on how crispy you want it to be. And that, guys, is our final image. Thanks for watching. If you've got any questions about any of the techniques that I've used here, just drop me a message, guys. Hit subscribe if you want to learn more. And yeah, actually, if you've got any questions, you can drop me a DM. You don't have to put it in the comments. Just get in touch any way you like. I will get back to you. And yeah, thanks for watching.